So, we've been talking about finding the worthwhile life in impossible situations, and I have to tell you guys, I've kept the secret. I know what the secret is, and it's, for me, it's to have a little something that I keep to myself that gives me joy that no one else knows about, and it's just a special thing that's just for me. And I don't like to show people this, but I'm going to because I care about all you guys, and I think you're special. And so, just give me a second. One second. Don't judge me too harshly. I think girls do the same thing with their special little underwear that they buy and things like that. To me, it's special to have a little secret. So I just thought I'd let you know. You can all leave. The secret to worthwhile life in impossible situations. Luckily for the Philippians, Paul was in prison, so he could only write them a letter. And back then, pants weren't invented yet, so I think his disrobing would have been slightly more dangerous. But the thing that gives me joy may not give you guys joy. Some of you guys laughed, most of you were grossed out. But it did get your attention. There's a funny thing about when someone starts to take off their clothes, people begin to watch. Like, it could be like a big, giant, hairy guy, and he's like, starts like taking off his shirt, and people are like, oh! Everyone's like, what? Oh! And they watch. And I don't get it, but it's human nature. And the point is that the things that give people joy draw people's attention. And in the passage that I'm talking about, Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11, Paul is specifically trying to draw the Philippians' attention to something. And so he does it by writing this weird little passage that has given interpreters and Christians inspiration, but also a whole bunch of trouble throughout their entire life. And here's what he does. He writes this like poem sort of thing, and he uses really weird vocabulary, and he uses phraseology that doesn't make any sense to anyone, and it's just really complex. He uses words that are only used once in the Bible. They're called homologumena, which is fun. You can tell that I've gone to school. And it doesn't look like anything else that Paul wrote. Because of that, a lot of times people think that this passage wasn't written by Paul, which in my mind is fine. Because the typical belief is that it's either something Paul wrote or it's a hymn that was being passed around during the times and he just kind of grabbed it and threw it in, which is fine by me. And there's two fields of thought, basically, on how to interpret this confusing passage with a lot of ambiguity and weird word choice. And number one is that it's a creed, like a creedal hymn, something that the authors wrote. They use concise, weird language to describe complex theological points. So like, have you guys ever read philosophy of anything? It's always really confusing. And they're using like words that mean a lot, but it's like, you'd be like, yeah, anyway. It's really confusing. And so people think that that's what's going on here, is it's a philosophical, like, little segment meant to convey truth, and that's why it's so complex. The other thought is that it's more like a poem. And so the word choices are stylistic. So where Paul says one thing one way and then a similar thing the other way, that's sort of like a comparison or a compare and contrast. And so people do that in poetry, and it's fine. And so my view is that they both work, but the second one is pretty nice. I kind of like it. I like the idea that Paul was writing or that this poem is a theological poem meant to call emphasis to draw attention to certain characteristics of God. And my rationale for this is pretty easy. And I haven't seen any commentators point out to it yet, but I don't understand why they don't. If you go to what Logan was talking about last week in Philippians, sorry, I thought I was in the right place. In Philippians chapter 2, in the first 4 verses, he's talking about how if you have any fellowship with the Spirit, you need to do this. Essentially, you need to be humble. And then he says, your attitudes need to be like Christ. And so it's basically what he's doing is he's trying to draw attention to Christ's humility so that we can take it as an example. Pretty easy enough. So I think Paul is what he's doing in this passage is he's using wording to draw attention to specific characteristics of God, namely humility. But it's not that easy, because this passage is really, it's pretty complex, and there's a lot going on there. So what I'm going to talk about is what is the comparison, or what's the example that we're supposed to be doing. What's the example that the Philippians are supposed to do? We've heard a lot about the Philippian situation, but essentially what's going on is they are in impossible situations. There's persecution going on sporadically throughout the empire, but in their situation it's harder than a lot of others. And so they're faced with the weight of the empire, they're faced with all the normal stresses of Christian living, and it's difficult. And so Paul's writing to encourage them, to give them joy, and to get their attention. I'm glad a couple of you got that. And so Paul gets their attention with this little passage. And it starts off with, your attitude should be the same as Christ, as that of Christ Jesus. And that's pretty straightforward. And then he goes into the meat of it. It says, who being in very nature God. And this part, being in very nature, is interesting because the word is morphe, which is a cool word, and sometimes it's translated as, I forget what it is. The Revised Standard Version has a different translation. But the word there, what it means is, it's like the physical representation of something, but also the essence. And there's not very many good English words to explain it. And so the idea that's portrayed is if you made an image of a god, that image is like the form of the god, but also in the philosophies of the day, the form would contain the essence of the thing it represents. This also comes from philosophical language of Plato, which I don't have time to talk about. But basically, this is really cool that he's using this word. It's a word that doesn't get used very much in the Bible. And what he's saying is Christ, the person of Christ, all that he was in his being, was the image of God. It's what God looked like. But at the same time, he is the essence of God. Essence as in source, substance. It's saying he has the same, he's of the same makeup as God. And so this word is a really big deal that he's using it. And there are other ways to say it. Later on it says equality with God, which is interesting, and I'll get to that next. I'll get to that later. Oh, I won't get to that. What he's saying with equality with God is just that it's another way of saying Christ has the divine nature, but the morphe word, the being in very nature God, is a way of saying it in a way that fit their philosophical framework. So that was kind of cool. And then it says, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. This word is really weird because the range of meaning is crazy. It could mean like a seizure, like to violently seize or hold on to something. Like it's in historical writings, there are quite a few cases where it's used to describe rape. But it's also seen as good fortune, like a windfall, or if you were walking down the road and you found an unattended donkey,